In 1241, the most powerful armies in Europe stood frozen in terror, not because of Genghis Khan, he was already dead, but because his generals were using a battlefield tactic so devastating, so psychologically crushing, that even the great Khan himself had tried to keep it secret from his own men. What if I told you that the Mongols' greatest weapon wasn't their horse archers, their siege engines, or even their legendary brutality? What if the real reason they conquered more land than any empire in history was something far more sinister? A tactic so effective that when enemy commanders discovered it, some chose to kill themselves rather than face it. And here's the truly disturbing part. This tactic is still being studied by military strategists today. But first, you need to understand why even Genghis Khan feared what would happen if this knowledge spread too far. The year was 1219. The Khwarazmian Empire had just made a fatal mistake. They'd killed Mongol ambassadors. Everyone knew what came next. Total annihilation. But the Shah's generals weren't worried. They had 400,000 men, fortified cities, and the defensive advantage. The Mongols had maybe 150,000 troops, stretched across thousands of miles. Simple mathematics said the Mongols would lose, but mathematics couldn't account for what happened next. Because the Mongols weren't planning to fight a conventional war. They were about to unleash something that would make strong men weep, that would turn brother against brother, that would make entire cities beg for death rather than face another day of waiting. Picture this. It's the 13th century. The Mongol Empire stretches from China to Eastern Europe, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Their armies move like lightning, appearing from nowhere, destroying everything, then vanishing like ghosts. Kings and emperors with armies 10 times larger surrender without fighting. But here's what the history books don't tell you. There was one specific tactic, used only by elite Mongol units, that was responsible for their most impossible victories. A tactic so powerful that Genghis Khan ordered it to be passed down only through whispered words between trusted generals. No written records. No witnesses left alive. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this secret was worth killing for. And why, when it was finally used against the Mongols themselves, it nearly destroyed their entire empire. The tactic had a name in Mongolian, Khuiten Zerk, the cold heart. Not because it required cruelty, but because it required something far more difficult. The ability to wait, to watch, to let fear do your killing for you. And it all started with a Chinese engineer named Bolin, a man who understood something that would revolutionize warfare forever, that the human mind, when left alone with its fears, becomes its own worst enemy. What Bolin taught the Mongols would echo through history, inspiring tactics used in World War II, Vietnam, and according to some sources, even modern psychological operations. But to understand its power, we need to go back to where it all began. The siege that should have been impossible, but instead became the stuff of nightmares. It began in 1211, during the siege of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing. The Jin dynasty had walls 40 feet high, 1 million defenders, and enough supplies to last 5 years. The Mongols had just 100,000 men. By every calculation, it was impossible. But Genghis Khan had recently recruited a Chinese engineer named Bolin, a man who'd spent 20 years studying something the Mongols had never encountered, the ancient art of psychological warfare. What Bolin whispered to Genghis Khan that night would change the course of history. "Great Khan," he said, "you can break their walls, but it will cost you half your army. Or you can break their minds, and the walls will open themselves." The next morning, something strange happened. The Mongol army began to retreat. The defenders cheered from the walls, thinking they'd won. But then they noticed something that made their blood run cold. The Mongols weren't just retreating. They were leaving something behind, thousands of them. What the defenders saw next would haunt Chinese military texts for centuries, because those weren't Mongol soldiers left behind. They were something far worse. And when the sun set that night, the real horror began. The figures left behind were mannequins, thousands of them, dressed in full Mongol armor, arranged in perfect battle formation. Each one held a real weapon, wore real armor taken from previous battles. From the walls, in the fading light, they looked exactly like a Mongol army preparing to attack, but they stood perfectly, impossibly still. The defenders waited for the attack. Hours passed, nothing. Dawn came, and the mannequins remained, unmoved, unblinking. That's when they noticed the banners. Each section of the mannequin army carried a banner with Chinese characters, simple messages. Day 1, we are patient. Your food dwindles. The psychological effect was immediate. Soldiers couldn't take their eyes off the motionless army. Were they real? Were some of them real? The mind began to play tricks. Guards reported seeing movement that wasn't there. Arrows were wasted on straw men. But this was just the beginning of Liu Bolin's masterpiece. Because every night, under cover of darkness, things would change. And what the defenders discovered on the morning of day 2 made strong men weep with fear. On the second morning, the mannequin army had moved. Not far, maybe 20 feet closer to the walls. But they'd moved. And their banners had changed. Day 2, we grow stronger. You grow weaker. The defenders went mad, trying to figure out how. They posted watches all night, strained their eyes in the darkness, but saw nothing. The Mongols had perfected the art of invisible movement. Small teams of their best warriors, dressed in black, moving individual mannequins inches at a time, so slowly that the human eye couldn't detect the motion. But movement wasn't the only change. Mixed among the mannequins were now real Mongol soldiers, trained to stand perfectly still for hours. The defenders couldn't tell which were real, which were fake. They started shooting at everything, wasting thousands of arrows. When they hit a real soldier who didn't flinch, didn't fall, the psychological damage was devastating. Were the Mongols even human? By day 7, the mannequin army had been joined by something new. Hundreds of ladders propped against each other in pyramid formations, each one numbered, counting down. 199-98. The defenders became obsessed with the numbers. What did they mean? When would they reach 0? Liu Bolin knew that the human mind abhors uncertainty more than death itself. Give a man a certain date of execution, and he can prepare. Give him uncertainty, and he'll execute himself with worry. The defenders stopped sleeping. They saw patterns that weren't there, heard signals in the wind. Soldiers began deserting, claiming the Mongols were using dark magic. But the true genius of the cold heart tactic was yet to be revealed, because while the defenders were fixated on the mannequins, on the numbers, on the mystery, the real attack had already begun, and it was happening in a place no one was watching. The Mongols had spent weeks before the siege studying the city's water supply. They knew every well, every stream, every cistern, and while the mannequin army held the defenders' attention, small teams of Mongol engineers were doing something that should have been impossible. They were poisoning the water supply, not with traditional poison. That would be detected immediately. They were using something far more insidious. Liu Bolin had discovered a plant that, when dissolved in water in tiny amounts, had no taste, no smell, no immediate effect. But over days, weeks, it accumulated in the body. It didn't kill. It did something worse. It made sleep impossible. It made the mind see things that weren't there. It turned fear into paranoia, paranoia into madness. By day 10, half the city was hallucinating. They saw the mannequins moving when they weren't. They heard Mongol war cries in the silence. Brothers accused brothers of being Mongol spies. The social fabric of the city began to tear itself apart. And that's when Genghis Khan revealed the most terrifying aspect of the cold heart tactic. But wait, here's where it gets truly insane. What if I told you the Mongols weren't even planning to attack the walls at all? What if the entire mannequin army, the numbered days, the poisoned water, all of it was designed to hide something so devastating that when historians finally uncovered the truth, they refused to believe it? You see, while the defenders were slowly going mad, while they watched those mannequins and counted those numbers, the real Mongol force was doing something that military experts still call impossible today. And in exactly 60 seconds, when you understand what really happened at Zhongdu, you'll see why this tactic was so dangerous. That Genghis Khan himself tried to ban it, because the cost of using it wasn't measured in enemy lives. It was measured in what it did to his own men. The Mongols had discovered that the most powerful weapon in warfare wasn't the sword or the bow. It was belief, and they were about to weaponize it in a way that would haunt military strategy for centuries. What happened next at Zhongdu would become the template for every psychological operation in history, from the ghost army of World War II to modern information warfare. But first, you need to understand the price, because some of the Mongol soldiers involved in the cold heart tactic were never the same again. They'd stared too long into the abyss of human fear, and something in them had broken, something that couldn't be fixed. While the city watched the mannequins, small teams of Mongols had spent 10 nights doing something unthinkable. They were digging, not tunnels under the walls. That would take months. They were digging something far more sinister. Graves, thousands of them, in perfect rows, each one marked with a Chinese name. On the morning of day 11, the defenders woke to see their own names on those graves. Not just soldiers, civilians, merchants, children. The Mongols had somehow acquired the city's census records. Every single person in Zhongdu had a grave waiting for them. But here's the truly horrifying part. Mixed among those empty graves were some that weren't empty. The Mongols had buried their own soldiers alive. Volunteers who'd taken a drug that slowed their heartbeat to almost nothing. When night fell, these corpses would climb out and return to camp, only to be buried again the next morning. The psychological effect was catastrophic. Defenders reported seeing the dead rise. The water poison made the visions worse, more real, more terrifying. Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers abandoned their posts. Civilians demanded surrender. The city's leaders, driven mad by sleeplessness and hallucinations, began to turn on each other. But the Mongol generals had taken the tactic too far. Their own men, the ones being buried and resurrected night after night, were beginning to lose their minds. Some couldn't tell if they were alive or dead. Others refused to leave their graves, convinced they belonged to the earth now. The drug that slowed their heartbeats had side effects no one had anticipated. Men forgot their names, their families, their reasons for fighting. The resurrection soldiers began to wander between the lines at night, neither fully Mongol nor fully dead, speaking in languages no one recognized. Both armies began to fear them. The Chinese called them Gui Bing, ghost soldiers. The Mongols called them the Lost. Some were found years later, still wandering the steppes, still believing they were dead. When Genghis Khan arrived and saw what was happening, he flew into a rage. The city had fallen without a single battle. Yes, but at what cost? Half the Mongol corpse soldiers had gone completely insane. The other half would never fight again, paralyzed by the memory of earth filling their mouths, of suffocating darkness, of being buried alive over and over. But worse than the human cost was what the tactic had revealed about the nature of warfare itself. The cold heart had worked too well. The city hadn't just surrendered, it had destroyed itself. Brothers had killed brothers. Mothers had smothered their own children to save them from the Mongols. The social fabric hadn't just torn, it had disintegrated entirely. Bolin himself, the architect of the tactic, was found in his tent, having taken his own life. His final message, scrawled in his own blood, simply read, "I have created something that should not exist." That night, Genghis Khan made a decision that would echo through Mongol military doctrine forever. He ordered the tactic sealed, forbidden, except in the most desperate circumstances. The Chinese engineer Bolin's writings were burned, his assistants executed or sworn to secrecy. But you can't uninvent an idea, especially one so devastatingly effective. The tactic didn't die, it evolved. At the Battle of Mohi in 1241, Mongol General Subutai used a modified version against the Hungarians. Instead of graves, he had his men build thousands of funeral pyres around the enemy camp, each one with a Hungarian shield on top. Every night, they'd light a few dozen, creating the illusion that Hungarian soldiers were being burned alive. The psychological pressure was so intense that King Bela IV's army of 100,000 men fled from a Mongol force one-third their size. The tactic spread, mutated, adapted. The Ottomans used it at Constantinople. Napoleon studied it before his Russian campaign, and according to declassified documents, both the CIA and KGB had programs dedicated to understanding what they called the Mongol Mind Break Protocol. In World War II, the British created the Ghost Army, inflatable tanks, and recorded sounds designed to confuse German intelligence. They cited Mongol tactics in their planning documents. In Vietnam, both sides used psychological warfare that traced its roots back to the Cold Heart. The Viet Cong's network of tunnels wasn't just for transportation. It was to create the illusion that they could appear and disappear at will, that they were everywhere and nowhere. But here's the twist that changes everything. In 1368, when the Mongol Empire finally fell, it wasn't to superior weapons or larger armies. The Chinese had learned the tactic, perfected it, and turned it against its creators. The last Mongol emperor didn't die in battle. He was found in his palace, surrounded by thousands of mannequins dressed as his own soldiers, each one holding a mirror. The message was clear. The Mongols' greatest weapon had become their ultimate downfall. Because when you teach your enemy that reality itself can be a weapon, don't be surprised when they use it against you. Modern military psychologists who study the Cold Heart tactic have reached a chilling conclusion. It worked because it exploited a fundamental flaw in human psychology: our need for certainty, for patterns, for meaning. Take those away, add fear and exhaustion, and the mind creates its own prison. The Mongols didn't need to break down walls. They just needed to make their enemies break themselves. And perhaps that's why, even today, military academies around the world study this tactic, but never officially acknowledge it. Because some weapons are too dangerous to exist, not for what they do to your enemy, but for what they do to you. If this story disturbed you as much as it did me when I first discovered it, you're probably wondering, what other military secrets have been buried by history? What other tactics were considered too dangerous to record? Well, next week, I'm releasing a video about the Roman legion that disappeared in Scotland, but not in the way you think. They were found 200 years later, but what they'd become, what they'd been forced to do to survive. Let's just say, there's a reason Rome never tried to conquer Scotland again. The truth about ancient warfare is darker than any fiction. These weren't just battles. They were laboratories for human psychology, pushing the boundaries of what the mind could endure. And sometimes, like with the Mongol grave tactic, they pushed too far. What do you think? Was Genghis Khan right to ban this tactic? Or in war, are all weapons fair game? Let me know in the comments. But be warned, once you start researching this stuff, you'll never look at history the same way again. Because the scariest thing about the Mongol grave tactic isn't that it worked. It's that somewhere, in some classified military manual, someone is probably updating it for modern warfare right now. Sleep tight, knowing that psychological warfare has only gotten more sophisticated since the 13th century. Sweet dreams.